We begin the day with U.S. plans for Venezuela and the start of an American role in the country's politics and economics that could last for years. It's been almost a week since U.S. forces captured Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. U.S. President Trump has now told the New York Times that the country's interim government is cooperating fully and, quote, giving us everything that we feel is necessary. It's important to note here that Venezuela's government today is comprised of officials who were, until last week, die-hard loyalists of Maduro. Well, President Trump says that the United States has already begun taking Venezuelan oil and plans to control its sale indefinitely, arguing the arrangement will lower global oil prices while generating revenue both for the U.S. and for Venezuela's reconstruction. Now, the president has offered no timeline for how long the United States plans to oversee the country, and he has offered no commitments on elections, saying only that America's role in Venezuela will last much longer than months. With Trump's interview with the New York Times, it was published after U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had briefed U.S. lawmakers on a three-phase plan for Venezuela. Officials familiar with the briefing say that the strategy envisions stabilizing the country and addressing its humanitarian and economic crisis, taking control of Venezuela's oil sector and selling its output, and ultimately installing a new government in Caracas. The plan signals an ambitious and long-term approach by Washington, and it is a plan that belies the claim that last week's capture of Nicolas Maduro was part of a limited law enforcement action. Well, I'm joined now by Roxanna Vigil, a foreign policy expert at the Council on Foreign Relations who has worked inside the U.S. government on Venezuela at the National Security Council and at the Treasury Department, where she helped shape sanctions policy. Roxanna, it's good to have you with us. So given that you've seen how Washington's Venezuela policy is built from the inside, let me start with this plan that Marco Rubio just presented to lawmakers. I mean, his plan is basically stabilization, recovery, and then transition. Do you buy it? Is it that simple?
So what I'm very focused on is what President Trump has said. And so far, President Trump has made clear that his focus is on rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector. He has not said anything about the transition to democracy in Venezuela. I understand that Secretary Rubio has indicated that, but I think until we hear a clear policy from President Trump, the concerns related to the U.S. government's lack of prioritization of a transition to democracy, I think, remain. And we also have just in the last day, President Trump indicating that the oil focus objective is going to take several years, which raises the question of when the transition to democracy is going to take place. When will the Venezuelan people be able to direct the future of their country? And then the last piece that sort of indicates some inconsistency with that vision that from the State Department is what the Secretary of Energy has said, which is the U.S. government's oil objective and the U.S. government's control over Venezuela's oil sector is going to be indefinite. So those things don't really match up with what we're hearing from the State Department about a transition to democracy being part of the plan.
Is your feeling then that what Marco Rubio has presented, is that maybe just window dressing to settle some very unsettled nerves in Congress for the time being?
I think what we have now is the U.S. government, the Trump administration, rejecting the democratically elected president-elect of Venezuela, Edmundo Gonzalez, rejecting opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, indicating that they don't have the support of the people, which does not line up with the reality on the ground that 70% of Venezuelans voted for Edmundo Gonzalez to essentially leave Chavismo behind. Venezuelans are ready to close the door on Chavismo, at least for the next chapter, and they're ready to move to something new, a change. So I do think there's cause for concern that a clear policy on when that might happen, how it might happen, has not been made clear.
It seems like, based on what we have seen in this week and in the events since last Friday, is that the Trump administration had one or two goals: to get Maduro out and also to reclaim the oil reserves in Venezuela. Everything else, though, and if I'm reading you correctly, everything else they're kind of making up as they go along. Is that how you see it?
That is how I see it, but I also think that the oil piece, as far as I can tell, there's no very clear vision on how that piece will be carried out. And in my view, to meaningfully rebuild Venezuela's oil sector, because it's going to take institutional changes, new laws, new economic framework, a stable government, that democratically elected government that investors feel confident can protect their investment. All that signals the need for a transition to democracy, which hasn't been articulated.
What's your read on what we've been hearing from the Trump administration? President Trump says that the U.S. will sell seized Venezuelan oil and control the proceeds to avoid corruption. Now, is that really safeguarding Venezuela, or is that just a way to make sure that you're controlling all the money?
So, not long ago, you have, just a few years ago, the Maduro regime and the opposition came together to agree on establishing a UN-controlled humanitarian trust fund that would try to address the most vulnerable population in Venezuela that have been the most impacted by the humanitarian crisis that's been going on for over 10 years in that country. So the big question for me is, aside from all the legal implications of the U.S. government controlling, funds that essentially belong to the Venezuelan people, is how is the management of these funds going to be done with input from the Venezuelan people, because it is their resources after all, and how are they going to actually benefit the Venezuelan people, because who's in charge right now is the exact same regime that Maduro ruled over, with the exception of the fact that now he's gone. It's the same people, the same corrupt structure that has led to this 10-plus year crisis. So how will these funds truly benefit the people?
So what would you say, what then is the minimum democratic roadmap that has to be announced now to keep this situation from becoming an open-ended control of Venezuela by the U.S.?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I think there needs to be a very clear path to a transition. And it's really up to the Venezuelan people to decide what that looks like, whether it's a transitional government before elections, whether it's Edmundo Gonzalez, who was elected just a year and a half ago. That's up to the Venezuelan people to decide, but there needs to be a clear path, ideally a clear path laid out very soon. And then there's the question of U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, which include the entire oil sector, but also there are sanctions against the financial sector, and the entire government of Venezuela has been blocked due to sanctions. So the question is the Trump administration going to remove those sanctions in order to allow Venezuela to be rebuilt?
Is it realistic to think then that Venezuela, its society, and the political body of the country, that can reform itself at the same time, in parallel? You've got the United States controlling the oil and all the money that's being made from the sale of that oil. I mean, can those two things coexist?
So in my view, what you have now is the same dictatorship, and there's no incentive for that dictatorship to change. There's an incentive for the dictatorship to try to consolidate itself and appease the U.S. government, but that still leaves the Venezuelan people living in a situation where the repressive dictatorship is controlling them through violence and through persecution and repression. So in order for there to be meaningful changes, including to governance and the rule of law, the kind of things you need for a stable economy, you do need that political process. It was never going to be easy. It was always going to be messy. So trying to delay that, in my mind, is a huge miscalculation and very short-sighted. That process needs to happen. it will slow things down a bit, but in the long term, it'll lead to further stability and real stability, not what you have now, which is a dictatorship that controls things through violence and persecution.
I want to ask you, before we run out of time, President Trump, he is not publicly backing the opposition leader, Machado. I mean, if key opposition figures, if they are being sidelined here, what does that do to the public buy-in and the street stability of a future Venezuela?
So I think it's raising a lot of uncertainty. And I think people are waking up to the fact that they might be living under the same dictatorship for the long term. If what President Trump means by many years is that the transition to democracy will come after that, which also means that the dictatorship might be there for the long haul and might grow stronger because they will then reap the benefits of rebuilding Venezuela's sector. So I do think there's a lot of uncertainty and consternation about what that means for Venezuelans in Venezuela.
Yeah, it's a sobering reality check, but it's the good counterbalance to what has been a week of very heady events, that's for sure. Roxanna Vigil, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights. Thank you.